The wind howled beyond the thin fabric walls of the camp tent, a relentless cry that scraped against the silence, like frozen shards of glass. Inside, the small space felt impossibly claustrophobic, the lingering scent of damp gear and stale breath mingling with the sharp metallic tang of unforgiving cold. Liam adjusted the strap of his backpack, the leather stiff and creaking in the Arctic chill, and forced himself to level his gaze on the man standing across from him. Evan. The name felt foreign on his tongue, already weighted with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Liam had spent almost a week in this god-forsaken ice expanse with the old company, focused on thawing out landscapes through his camera lens, capturing the brutal beauty of raw isolation. And then, just before departure, the sudden corporate merger had reshaped his world. Evan, the new boss, had been installed over his head and everyone else's, shadow that accompanied him now, breathing down his neck as thoroughly as the Arctic wind stung his skin. Evan was impossible to read. The first time Liam saw him, standing amidst the scattered camera tripods and heavy expedition packs, his broad shoulders compacted into a thick parka, Liam noticed the way the faint scar on Evan's left cheek caught the wan light, a pale slash against sun-bleached skin. His steel-blue eyes scanned the camp, restless and alert, but when they landed on Liam, there was nothing but a cool appraisal, no warmth. No invitation. "I'm assuming you're Liam," Evan said, voice low, but edged with an easy kind of authority, the kind that didn't bother disguising discomfort beneath faux charm. "I've read your reports from the former management. Impressive work. But we'll need more precision moving forward." Liam nodded, his heartbeat quickening for reasons he refused to acknowledge. Impressive work. As if that could bridge the gap between a man who spent his days coaxing emotions out of frozen landscapes and a corporate suit who measured everything in spreadsheets and bottom lines. "I'll do my best," Liam said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Evan shifted, breaking the fragile silence with a grunt of cold air. "Good. We move faster now. No room for mistakes." Liam's fingers curled around the edge of his camera bag, knuckles pale beneath thin gloves. He swallowed back a rising tide of bitterness. This wasn't how he imagined the expedition going. The North had always meant escape, a chance to breathe outside the suffocating expectations of the city and the never-ending race for validation. Now, with Evan shadowing every step and every shutter click, it felt like the ice was closing in on him, not just outside in the storm, but inside himself. The tent creaked as Evan unrolled his sleeping mat opposite Liam's. Their shared quarters were cramped, thin foam mattresses side by side, barely enough space to stretch without kicking the other. Pale glow of a single lantern cast long shadows, exaggerating every sharp edge of their faces. Liam caught himself staring, suddenly aware of the way Evan's tousled sandy hair caught the light, the way his angular jaw tightened with effort to contain some hidden emotion. The faint scar on his cheek was a stark reminder that beneath the polished exterior lay stories, battles, and scars Liam couldn't see. Months ago, Liam might have felt curiosity. Now, it was tangled with something taut, almost painful, a confusing mixture of resentment and a reluctant pull he refused to articulate. His own desires had always lived quietly, in the background, whispered in moments of loneliness and hope. But here, in this barren landscape where survival depended on stoicism and control, admitting those feelings felt like exposure, a vulnerability Liam wasn't ready to reveal. The wind rattled the loose fabric overhead, and Liam's breath fogged inside the tent. Pulled his parka tighter, the scratch of fabric a small comfort. "So," he said, forcing words that felt awkward, "this merger means you're taking over the photography division?" Evan's lips curved just slightly, almost amused. "Not just the division. The whole operation." He looked at Liam like a man appraising his next move on a chessboard. "Don't take it personally. It's business." Liam exhaled slowly, the air tasting cold and sharp. "Right." Business. The words hung between them, brittle and fragile. Neither of them moved to bridge the distance, the small space feeling cavernous despite their close proximity. Liam caught the faint scent of pine from Evan's jacket, mingled with something warmer, muskier underneath. A human warmth he craved, yet mistrusted. All at once the tent flap shuddered violently as the blizzard's roar surged outside, the wind battering the encampment with fresh fury. Instinctively, Liam reached out, tightening a strap on a nearby pack as the tent sagged under the weight of ice and snow. The storm had come sooner than predicted, and its wrath was absolute. "Looks like we're stuck here longer than I thought," Evan said, his voice low, the usual edge softened just enough that Liam caught the shift. "No way to move until this calms down." Liam shrugged, trying to mask the knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. Being trapped was one thing. Having Evan here, this unnervingly silent presence sharing his space, was another altogether. The night dragged on, thick with the howl of the storm. Outside, the world was erased beneath blinding curtains of white, the biting cold seeping through every layer of fabric and skin. Inside the tent, shadows deepened as the lantern's flame flickered uncertainly, casting long, quivering shapes against frost-lined canvas. Liam lay back on his sleeping mat, muscles stiff from hours of tension. The warmth of his parka barely kept the chill at bay. He watched Evan folding his gear with precise, practiced movements, broad hands sliding over cold fabric, the faint scar on his cheek catching the flickering light like a secret. An unexpected restlessness prowled his chest. He wanted distance, yet the proximity was magnetic. His fingers itched to reach out, to brush away the layers of ice around the man who held the power to upend everything Liam thought he understood about duty, control, and desire. Suddenly, the tent flap snapped open with a gust of wind, and Evan moved quickly, not hesitating as he crossed the narrow space between their mats. Liam's breath caught. The cold had numbed his limbs, but heat bloomed sharp and wild, as Evan peeled off his outer gloves and settled beside him. "Too cold," Evan muttered, voice rougher than before. His presence so close made the world constrict to the narrow band of warmth shared between them. Liam stiffened, caught off guard. "Evan?" "Stay with me," he said, almost a whisper. The usual armor cracked just enough to let something raw and unsaid tumble free. The words hung heavy, fragile as icicles ready to break. Liam's heart thundered in his ears, the sound loud enough to drown out the storm. He looked into those steely blue eyes, sharp, vulnerable, aching, and saw reflected there a loneliness he hadn't expected to find so far from the edge of the world. What was he supposed to say to that? What could he say to a man who had never before shown anything but cold control? Liam hesitated, the silence stretching and trembling between them. Then, slowly, carefully, he shifted closer, the heat of their bodies igniting a fragile ember against the Arctic freeze. In that cramped, frostbitten tent, under the fury of a blizzard that obliterated all else, two men silently reached towards something neither was yet ready to name stolen connection, a fragile surrender. The night around them deepened, holding its breath as the cold outside sharpened its edge. But inside, in that fragile silence, courage began to stir. The morning came slow and grey, the light struggling through the thick curtain of clouds that swallowed the horizon. Liam's breath formed pale ghosts in the chilly dawn as he peeled back the flaps of the tent with tentative fingers. The storm had not relented, but its violence had softened to an uneasy sigh. Outside, the world was raw, snow drifted in mounded heaps like the scorched earth of some frozen battlefield. Trees, though far behind their line, groaned under heavy burdens of ice, sagging and trembling, their limbs barely clinging to the air. Evan was already roused, sitting cross-legged on the ground outside the tent, knees dusted with frost, eyes scanning the horizon with a meticulous gaze that seemed to map every fallen twig and drift. "We'll have to check the cameras before the light's gone," he said, without looking up. His voice held the barest edge of command, but beneath it was something less harsh, more grounded. "Looks like a mess," Lamb muttered, exhaling a jagged puff of steam as he crouched beside Evan. The world felt too sharp, too infinite, yet somehow smaller now, as if their shared isolation had carved a pocket away from everything else. Evan nodded, folding his gloves, then stowing them into a pocket. The wind tore through the line on the western side. "We'll need to dig out the equipment and reset the markers." The task ahead was daunting. They stood amidst a landscape blasted to silence, each step a muffled crunch into snow, thick and unyielding. There was no place for furniture or kindness here, only survival. Yet, as they moved together, a strange synchronicity born out of necessity. Liam noticed how Evan methodically aimed to soften the jagged edges of the work. When Liam stumbled over an unseen root, frozen beneath the snow, Evan reached out a steadying hand, fingers briefly brushing his wrist. A flicker of something warm passed between them, faint as the aurora's glow, but far more tangible. "You all right?" Evan asked, voice low and steady. "Yeah," Liam said, feeling the question was more than routine. There was no condescension here, no superiority, as if the storm had broken down more than just their shelter. They moved deeper into the field, lifting tarps and clearing ice-encrusted gear. Evan took charge of the heavier loads without complaint, inching closer when Liam's gloved fingers numbed as he struggled with a stubborn camera stand. "Let me," Evan said, his hands easy around tools and equipment like they belonged there. An expert despite everything. Liam stepped back, watching him ease the mechanism back into place, with a decisive twist and a clank that sounded more satisfying than expected, like a broken silence finally shattering. "You really know your way around this?" he asked. Evan shrugged, a shadow crossing his features. "More than I'd like to admit." His humor was dry, nearly lost in the wind, but it still reached Liam's ears. "My old team trained me well." As they worked, Liam picked up on the little gestures Evan made, tucking snow into the edges of loose cables, pausing to cover sensitive lenses with his scarf, wiping frost from the display screens with a gentle care that almost felt out of place in the harshness around them. It was unlike the strict, distant boss Liam had met days ago, replaced by a man whose attention to detail bordered on reverence for the fragile gear that tethered them to their art and to the world beyond the endless white. The storm's residual chill bit through their insulated jackets, but the shared labor kindled something else. A quiet, steady rhythm that softened tension's tight coil around Liam's chest. They were no longer boss and employee, just two men crouched in the snow, caught in the vastness of isolation, forced to rely on one another to push past the day's brutal demands. When the last camera was reset and the markers realigned, Evan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Not the worst day we've had," he said, voice rough but lighter, like the first crack in a thin ice sheet. Liam glanced at him, searching for a flicker of the impenetrable man he'd known. Instead, he found eyes shadowed with fatigue and something softer. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. "No," Liam agreed. "Not the worst." The words felt fragile but true, an unspoken bond, forming in the cold air between them. They made their way back toward the cabin, the silence deeper now, but no longer empty. Behind Evan's stoic exterior, Liam glimpsed tiny acts of kindness, pulling his scarf tighter around Liam's neck when the wind caught him off guard, steadying his arm when the snow slipped beneath their boots, the way his gaze softened ever so slightly. When Liam caught his eye, inside the dim warmth of the cabin, the world was muffled now to the quiet drip of melting ice and the faint hum of the generator. Liam set down his pack, exhaustion prickling beneath his skin. Evan was already seated at the worn wooden table, tools splayed across its surface, delicate pieces of camera machinery waiting for reassembly. Liam settled beside him, fingers twitching to help but unsure where to begin. The small cabin felt crowded with unspoken words, the weight of their shared night settling thick in the still air. Evan's hands were steady and sure, coaxing the camera's intricate parts back to life. Yet his voice betrayed a weariness no amount of control could mask. "It's harder than I thought," he said, almost to himself. "Managing the merger, I mean." Liam paused, watching. "How do you mean?" Evan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer, fingers stilling over a delicate lens. Then he spoke, voice quieter, edged with an honesty that startled in its rarity. "It's like I'm supposed to have all the answers right, lead with certainty. But every day there's more at stake, more people depending on me to be steady." He looked up briefly, steel blue eyes searching, as if for a lifeline. "And I feel lost." The admission hung between them, fragile as the frost on the cabin window. Liam's heart thudded painfully. Here was the man who'd seemed so untouchable, striping away his facade piece by piece, exposing the loneliness beneath the armor. "I didn't know it got like that," Liam said, softly. The edge of something unfamiliar, blooming inside him a tenderness. Empathy he hadn't expected to feel for this man who'd been his boss barely a week ago. "I guess nobody ever really tells you, do they? But the people who seem strongest carry the heaviest weight." Evan's gaze lingered on him, the rough scar on his cheek catching the faint light. "I'm used to hiding it," he said, voice rough with the weight of long-held burdens. "But here, out here, it's impossible to pretend everything's fine. Not when the cold cuts through your skin, and even your breath feels like fire." Liam felt something shift between them, the fragile truce of the last few days deepening into something that trembled on the edge of trust. "You're not alone," he found himself saying, surprised at his own words. "Not while I'm here," Evan's lips twitched. An almost smile that was a promise and a question rolled into one. "I might not be the easiest person," he confessed, "but I'm glad you are." The weight of those words, their simplicity, their truth, settled like a warm ember in Liam's chest. They sat side by side, the warmth from the cabin barely touching, the cold gnawing at the edges of the world outside, but enough to kindle something more enduring between them. For the first time that day, Liam felt like he wasn't just surviving the Arctic storm. He was beginning to navigate a path through the darker, wilder storm inside Evan. And perhaps, for the first time, he could see a light beyond the frostbite. The meager glow of the single lantern hanging from the low cabin ceiling flickered softly against the roughly hewn wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Outside, the Arctic wind roared in relentless gusts, rattling the thin window panes. But inside, the atmosphere felt almost impossibly fragile, like the quiet hum after a thunderclap. Between them sat a small makeshift table, piled with the remnants of their dinner-canned stew, warmed on the tiny stove, chewy bread, and lukewarm tea that stung the tongue more than it soothed. Liam spooned another mouthful of stew, the thin broth salty and slightly gamey, a flavour that reminded him painfully of the wild, untamable land outside. His fingers trembled slightly as he fought the chill that still had a grip deep in his bones. Evan was across from him, eyes watching Liam's every movement with a light that was difficult to decipher. Part curiosity, part caution, part something else that made Liam's pulse pick up, and then skip. Without fully intending to, a small quip slipped from his lips, a clumsy attempt to break the silence that had thrived between them like a living thing all evening. "I'm beginning to think this stew is less Arctic delicacy and more desperate culinary experiment." Evan's stern face cracked open, ever so slightly, that faint twitch of amusement returning to the corner of his mouth. "You mean you don't like it?" "I was beginning to think you were going to ask for seconds." Liam laughed silently, the sound muffled as he covered his mouth with his sleeve. The humour was fragile, almost absurd in a place so bleak, but it felt like a thread connecting them, way out of the heavy stillness. "I'm not sure if I should applaud your optimism or feel sorry for your palate," Liam said, voice still quiet but steadier. Evan shrugged, his broad shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. "Both, I suppose. I do like a challenge." The corners of Liam's mouth lifted into a grin, and the tension that had tied his chest in knots loosened just enough to make room for something light, something hopeful. "Challenge accepted, then. I'll try not to starve." Evan's eyes rested on him a moment longer, steel blue contrasting with Liam's deep green like two storms, colliding silently in the flickering light. "Maybe one day you'll appreciate my cooking skills," he said, words a dare and a promise all at once. "Maybe," Liam replied, the word hanging between them like a tentative step forward. The laughter settled over them like fragile ice cracking underfoot, a momentary freedom from the weight of survival and silence. The softness didn't last. Beyond the thin walls, harsh voices cut through the night like jagged shards. The raucous insults and low sneers seeped in through the cold, an unwelcome reminder of the rigid hierarchies and judgments that clung to their team like a blizzard. Liam stiffened his fork, pausing halfway to his mouth, as the unmistakable sound of Roddy's voice echoed from the adjacent tent. Loud and cruel. "Look at him," the mocking tone sneered, "fiddling with the gear like a scared little boy. How long till he cracks? I give it 2 days before he's sobbing in some corner." Liam's jaw clenched, the blood in his veins flaming hot, despite the Arctic chill. He could feel the old self-doubt rising unbidden, that gnawing ache made sharper by the relentless isolation. But more than that, an unfamiliar fierce protectiveness surged within him, a hard edge of something Evan had long ago silenced, but was roaring now in Liam's chest. Before he could say anything, Evan's voice, low and deadly calm, cut through the insult like a blade. "You want to say that again, Roddy?" There was a pause, heavy enough to crush ice, followed by a scoff. "What?" "Can't handle a bit of truth." Evan's laugh was slow, controlled, but laced with an unmistakable warning. "It's not truth when it's just cruelty, wearing a mask. And I won't stand for it in my team." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken challenge, and Liam felt the air between them shift. His own heart hammered, not just from the adrenaline of confrontation, but from a sudden deep astonishment. Evan, the cold enigma who had worn distance like armor, was not stepping away. Instead, he was stepping in, standing with Liam, in a way neither had done before. Roddy grumbled a curse, and the voices retreated, leaving a silence so profound it pressed down like fresh snow. Liam exhaled, the tension in his muscles loosening imperceptibly. For a moment, just a brief, uncertain moment, Liam locked eyes with Evan. The faint scar on Evan's cheek seemed to deepen in the wan light, but the hardness in his gaze had softened, transformed into something like solidarity. "Thanks," Liam said, his voice low but deliberate. "I didn't expect you to." Evan cut him off with a rare, almost shy smile. "Neither did I. But maybe we both need reminders that the worst storms aren't always outside." Liam nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling like fresh snow on a ridge. It was a small thing, this act of defense. Not a grand gesture, but enough to crack the ice between them. Enough to begin turning fragile distance into fragile trust. It was terrifying as much as it was remarkable, reaching out, leaning in, depending on someone who until recently had been almost a stranger. But something trembled in Liam's chest, an ember glowing bright enough to light the way through the darkest Arctic night, and in that small, fragile moment, he dared to hope it might be enough. The cabin's small stove hummed quietly, its flickering flame casting long, wavering shadows against the wood-panelled walls. Outside, the Arctic stillness pressed so heavily it seemed to drown out every other sound, save the occasional whistle of the wind through the loose seals around the tent frame. Liam leaned back against the rough grain of the bench, the warmth of the stove filtering through his jacket where it hung open. Across from him, Evan sat with his elbows resting on his knees, hands curled around a chipped enamel mug that steamed faintly in the dim light. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence felt less like distance now, and more like a fragile truce between two men who had, without quite acknowledging it, taken a step closer. Liam was the first to break it, voice low and careful. "You ever get tired of pretending?" The words floated into the room, soft but steady, if the question had been rolling around inside him for days. Of leading, or managing, keeping all the pieces together when inside you're breaking apart. Evan's eyes flicked up, catching Liam's in the firelight. There was a flicker of something, a quiet recognition maybe, or a pang of shared fatigue. "All the time," Evan said finally, voice rougher than usual. "Leadership's a mask, isn't it? Not just for the team or the company, but for yourself. Showing strength when you don't feel it, smiling when everything inside wants to collapse." He ran a hand through his hair, the faint scar on his cheek catching the light. "I learned early that vulnerability was a liability. Outside the tent, outside the office, it's easier to be invincible than to admit you're broken." Liam nodded slowly, tracing the rim of his mug with a finger. "I used to think being strong meant being alone. You bear the silence so it doesn't crush the people around you. But out here, maybe the silence is just louder when you're by yourself." His voice cracked just a little, a tremor that bled beneath the words. "I don't want to pretend any more. Not with you." Evan's breath hitched, a flicker of something unspoken, threading through the air between them. This was no longer CEO and employee, or boss and subordinate. It was two men who had been shaped and scarred in ways neither fully understood, laid bare beneath a frozen sky. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Not here. Not with you." "Neither did I," Liam murmured, feeling the heat rise into his cheeks despite the cold. "But I'm glad. Because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to armor up all the time." He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Want to tell me about that scar?" he asked, nodding at the faint line on Evan's cheek. "If you want to." Evan looked down at his mug, fingers tightening around it as if weighing whether to hand over a piece of himself. After a breath, he began, voice steady but laden with memory. "Long story, but I'll try to keep it short. When I was in my early 20s, before all this, before corporate," he said with a faint nod towards the tent and cameras, "I was heading back from a mountain climb. I slipped on some ice, fell, and the rocks caught me on the way down. It left me with this." He gestured toward the scar, then ran his hand absently over his cheek. "It's not just a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. It's a reminder no one saw the real me behind it. Everyone wanted the picture of a guy who never broke." Liam swallowed hard, absorbing the vulnerability hidden beneath the stoic exterior. "Sounds lonely," he said simply. "To carry that, and no one knowing." It was, Evan agreed. And maybe that's why it's easier to stay guarded. Easier not to let anyone in than to risk being seen and rejected. The first time, Evan's gaze didn't flit away. He looked at Liam like he saw him, not the employee, not the obligation, but the man beneath. The quiet desperation, the longing for something real in this endless frozen expanse. "I'm tired," Evan confessed. "Tired of the masks, the expectations, the silence that fills every room I walk into. It's suffocating." His voice cracked just slightly, confessing more than words often allowed. Liam's chest tightened. "Me, too." He met Evan's eyes, feeling something shift, a thread of connection tightening between them. "What if we stopped pretending? Just for tonight?" Evan's lips twitched upward, a half-smile that was almost reluctant, almost shy. "For tonight," he agreed. They sat together, the gap between them shrinking as the warmth from the stove wrapped around their shoulders. Liam's thoughts churned beneath the quiet of loneliness and longing and the strange safety of shared secrets. He realized that in the vast, endless cold of the Arctic, this small warmth was a lifeline, fragile but fierce. Hours slipped by unnoticed, their stories weaving between them like threads of fire. Liam spoke of his childhood, growing up in a small town where being different meant being invisible. The nights he spent dreaming of a life where he could just breathe without fear. Evan shared memories from early jobs steeped in pressure and solitude, the suffocating weight of expectations, the longing for acceptance buried beneath years of professional polish. There was laughter too, soft, cautious laughter, that cracked the surface of their guarded facades. For once, their conversation wasn't measured by etiquette or hierarchy, but by the quiet intimacy of two people beginning to trust. Just as Liam was beginning to feel a fragile peace settle over him, the cabin plunged suddenly into darkness. The hum of the stove cut out, the soft static of electronic devices died. The biting cold crept in with immediate appetite. Evan cursed under his breath, frowning as his eyes adjusted to the black. Liam's heart slammed in his chest, the abrupt change laying their vulnerability bare once more. "Power's out," Evan said, voice low but more distant now. "Fuck frozen circuits." He rose, reaching blindly for the emergency lantern hanging near the door. The faint click echoed in the tent, but the lantern remained stubbornly unlit. "Looks like we're on our own," Liam said, swallowed cold mixing with adrenaline. "That storm must have knocked the lines." Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Figures. Of course it would." The cold surged in immediately, sharp and invasive, seeping through Liam's jacket and chilling his skin. The knowledge that the isolation outside hadn't changed. No rescue was coming anytime soon made the moment heavier. "Stay close," Evan said, voice quieter now, a suggestion loaded with unspoken meaning. Liam didn't hesitate. He moved closer, sliding his legs out to sit beside Evan on the bench, their shoulders brushing, warmth transferring, like a secret pulse between them. The cold was a physical thing, biting and unrelenting, yet the nearness of Evan's body, the steady beat of his heart beneath the rough fabric of his shirt, was a balm Liam hadn't realized he needed so desperately. They sat in silence, the cabin narrowing around them like a cocoon, without the harsh glare of the stove or the distractions of the outside world. Everything was quieter, more intense. Words felt heavy, fragile. Both men were acutely aware of the spaces between them, the unspoken confessions, the truths they wouldn't dare voice, but that hung in the air like crystalline frost. Liam's fingers twitched nervously at his knees, longing to reach out, to brush a hand against Evan's arm, to feel simple contact that might undo the shiver crawling down his spine. But the fear held him back, the fear of ruining whatever fragile ground they had reclaimed. Evan's gaze lingered, steel blue eyes flicking with something softer, something almost tender, that Liam had never seen before. It wasn't a promise or an invitation. It was something harder to name, but just as electrifying, the acknowledgement of feeling too long contained. The silence stretched. Not empty, but full of possibility and hesitation, and the thrill that only comes when two guarded hearts inch towards something vulnerable. Neither spoke, but the quiet said everything. It said, "I'm here. I see you. Don't know what comes next, but for now I won't let go." Outside, the Arctic night raged on, indifferent, vast, infinite. But within the small cabin, two men found warmth, not just from shared body heat, but from the fragile, blossoming trust that folded between them like a secret flame struggling against the cold. Morning seeped in quietly, soft, pale light, filtering through the frost-laced window panes of the little Arctic tent. The world outside, still blanketed by sprawling ice and snow, seemed momentarily hushed, a fragile serenity resting atop the relentless tundra. Inside, the stale, tightly packed air of the previous night had thinned, replaced by something bracing and unspoken. Liam's breath came out in slow, measured puffs, crystallizing in the chill morning. His heart, on the other hand, pounded with a tumultuous urgency that no cold could dull. He sat rigidly on the edge of his cot, fingers curled around a lukewarm mug of coffee, tasting bitterness and what felt like years of unsaid words. The weight of everything, the endless, frozen white outside, the tension that had threaded between him and Evan all night pressed in on him. But beneath that pressure, there was something else, simmering, raw and demanding. The truth clawing at his throat would no longer be ignored. Not now. He glanced across the narrow tent at Evan, whose breathing was steady, eyes closed as if in quiet meditation. The flicker of early sunlight caught the faint scar on Evan's cheek, softening the rugged angles of his face. Liam saw him now, not as the unapproachable stoic boss with sharpened edges, but as a man carved by circumstance and restraint. Man who maybe had been just as alone and starved for connection as Liam had been in this frozen wasteland. The moment stretched taut as the thin walls around them. Liam's fingers twitched again, his jaw tightening as he wrestled inwardly with the risk he was about to take. What if it shattered everything? What if Evan rejected him and this fragile trust burned away, leaving only cold ashes? But he couldn't keep pretending, not to himself, not to Evan, not with the dawn bringing clarity to every shadow. Evan, Lem's voice was low, tentative, almost swallowed by the small space, but enough to catch the other's attention. Evan's eyes blinked open, meeting Liam's with sluggish alertness, as if surfacing from some deep, guarded place. The air shifted, heavy with anticipation. "I can't keep this to myself anymore," Liam admitted, voice trembling like fragile ice ready to crack. "The things I feel, everything we've been dancing around. It's not just about the Arctic, or work, or survival. It's you. It's always been you." The words hung raw and exposed, vulnerable as the landscape outside. Evan's pupils widened fractionally, but he didn't step back or close off. Instead, the scarred line of his jaw softened, the steel blue of his eyes darkening with something more complicated than surprise, something that trembled on the edge of hope. "I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am," Evan said in a voice that carried the weight of years spent locking himself away, of battles fought silently. "I've always lived, one way straight, certain." Liam nodded slowly, swallowing the knot of fear curling in his stomach. "I figured that much. But feelings, they don't always come with instructions or promises. They just are. They pull you in, whether you want them to or not. Evan's gaze dropped to his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the muscles in his forearms flexing in quiet turmoil. "I don't want to hurt you," he said at last, voice taut with conflicted honesty. "I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not. But this," he gestured vaguely between them, "this feels real. Different, softer." His gaze flicked back to Liam's, the hardness melting into something watchful, careful. "Maybe more than friends, but I'm scared too." Liam's chest tightened in a mixture of relief and a cautious, blossoming hope. "We don't have to know everything right now," he whispered. "We just have to agree to try. To be real with each other,